Well, hello. Welcome to another short devotional. This one will be just a little bit different. I want to share with you a video that I found recently. It's about a little girl by the name of Pearl Joy Brown, a special little girl born with such a rare birth condition that doctors wanted her mom and dad to abort her. They listened to what they believed was God's word to their hearts and lives, and as a result, this little girl lived 5.5 years. This story tells about the dignity and importance of life, all life. With the election coming up in a few short days, we need to think, will our vote support and encourage women to rethink the abortion of their children? Or by not voting, are we inviting in those who believe in aborting a child nearing full term? There are many more lessons that I received in listening. I wrote down each word that Eric Brown's testimony gave at the Evangelicals for Life gathering. His testimony speaks about the dignity of each life, but also the importance of seeing God's hand in the trials and sufferings we go through. I hope you will listen to this and think and pray. This is a beautiful testimony. I present to you the testimony by Eric Brown concerning his daughter, Pearl Joy Brown. Until next time, I remain your friend, Lana D.
So I should probably say right off the bat that I'm not a public speaker. In fact, I don't know the last time I even spoke into a microphone, and I've never done it in front of a group gathered with the same intentionality as this one. But when offered the opportunity to share what God has done for my family, I feel compelled to speak up and not sit quietly. My prayer has been that rather than trying to be clever and quotable, I will simply tell the truth of God's kindness and mercy toward my family. And if I sound timid and awkward, like I'm reading every word from pages held by sweaty hands, it's because that's exactly what I'm doing right now. I am both thankful and intimidated to be here. Rest assured, however, that any time of yours wasted on my behalf will be redeemed before the weekend is over. I've brought along a few photos to share to help paint a picture that words alone likely cannot express. I'm a photographer by trade, and a few years ago, I set out to invite others into our story using words and photographs to share what life with Pearl is actually like. That it's neither a nonstop festival of Thanksgiving nor 24/7 hardship and heaviness. Life with Pearl is a solid mixture of both of these things at different times. And there's an appropriate amount of mundane thrown in for good measure. And I hope that these photographs will help my words to tell a clearer truth. I love my family, and I'm so grateful that God has chosen my wife, Ruth, and me for the task of shepherding our 3 children, and that he has chosen Brennan and Abigail to walk alongside of Pearl, carrying their sibling over each new and unexpected threshold. Aside from her, we are about the most ordinary family one could possibly imagine, and I rarely feel the need to aim much higher. Pearl's life has been an explosion of grace, detonated by God in our community, sending waves of perspective resonating through a fallout zone I could have never planned. And I feel nothing but a sense of privilege and awe for him choosing us to be our parents. I don't speak as a theologian, as an expert, or even as a college-educated man. I'm just a working-class dad trying to shepherd my family while paying close enough attention to not miss a single aspect of God's character that he is putting on display He has set out to change all of us, to make us more like him, and I want to be wholly engaged in that process. Our third child, Pearl Joy Brown, was born shortly after midnight on July 27, 2012. After a pregnancy that was wrought with both heartache and hope, she was diagnosed with a condition known as Alobar Holoprosencephaly during our 20-week ultrasound. And we were advised on that day to induce labor, say goodbye, and try again. It was a belittling conversation trying to convince that doctor that if Pearl was alive, but she was having troubles, then we had no interest in taking her away from the provision that Ruth's womb was giving. We knew very well what would happen if we did, and there was no way that Pearl's body had developed enough to survive outside of Ruth's body. She was being sustained in there, and God was still knitting her together, and it seemed cruel to us to take away the very system that was helping her broken body do what it was incapable of doing on its own. I've often wondered, however, if God had not written certain truths on our hearts so long ago, if we would have made the same decision to choose life for Pearl. And honestly, I don't know. It's a daunting thing to be given a diagnosis that is not compatible with life, and everything about what you were told is seemingly hopeless. Unbelief certainly is not a justifier, but we fallen people have a long history of lacking hope and perspective even when lives are at stake. I suppose that makes it all the more important that we continue to speak the gospel with compassion and understanding to one another and to a world that desperately needs hope. Apart from Christ, our decisions on so many things default in directions that end in death. There are countless others in similar situations who've decided to go in the opposite direction than we did, and the lack of hope and perspective that leads one to make such a move should only further invigorate us to shout loud from the rooftops what we know is true about every single human life. But as rattling as those initial appointments were, we were confident that God was executing a plan for Pearl that he had written before the foundation of the world. I'd spent previous years doing substantial reading on suffering and disability and God's goodness in and sovereignty over such situations, and we were aware on the deepest possible level that this was his doing, that he was working, and that the primary reason to carry Pearl to term was not for her sake, but because we ought to not interrupt the master creator when he is at work. It has nothing to do with some utilitarian prospect of a child who may grow up to be the next president or Mother Teresa, and everything to do with abiding and participating. Potential for societal contribution or skill or productivity seems hardly a reason to choose life, especially when contribution is measured on a scale such as that. The subtleties of these defenses can be damaging and dehumanizing to children who didn't make it to term, or who did but live with severe disability. And as I look back, I really do not know what drove me to read so much about suffering and sovereignty in those years prior, but I now see it as divinely orchestrated groundwork for this season that God was preparing me for. He was working, and we knew that if we proclaimed that God had knit her siblings together in Ruth's womb, then we had to say that he was doing the same for Pearl. It's not as if he stepped out for a break or as if he left her development to the forces of nature and happenstance while he carried on with other tasks. Our hearts were overflowing with the sense that this was God's handiwork, and I remember just how clear certain phrases from hymns and scriptures began resonating in a way they otherwise likely never would have. God gave Pearl an inverted nose on purpose. He gave her 3 incredibly kissable lips on purpose. He took away her vision, her hearing, her speaking, and even her ability to intentionally move any part of her body, all on purpose. And then he lovingly gave her a tiny, hollow, single hemisphere of a brain at the tip of her brainstem. He was calling all of us to trust him, that though he didn't necessarily call Pearl's disability good, he was certainly working all of it together for our good and his glory. Certainly the fall has impacted everything in its wake, but I am doubtful that the curse kept God from knitting Pearl together as he saw fit. All of it was on purpose, for purpose, and we had no choice but to trust him. We had assumed throughout most of the pregnancy that the only 2 options for Pearl would be complete and miraculous healing or certain death. The doctors expected death, either before she was born, during her delivery, or within moments of her birth. And we prayed and hoped for a miracle, though with each new and more devastating ultrasound, we assumed the doctors would likely be correct in their predictions. And though I think Ruth would tell you she felt otherwise, I never truly considered that God had written a third way. I'd see families out and about caring for their child with special needs, and I remembered just how badly I wanted what they had. I pleaded with God to just give us that difficult life and to not go so far as to take Pearl's life. I wanted so badly the privilege of pushing around a wheelchair with an oxygen tank strapped to the side, but I had no idea of what I was asking. And often, when I look back on the desperation of those prayers, I'm so thankful that I had no idea. Perhaps if I had known how hard it would be, without truly grasping how wonderfully rich life would be, then I wouldn't have pleaded Pearl's case as vigorously as I did. But how grateful I am that God said yes. Being given a diagnosis that is not compatible with life changed literally everything about how we move forward with prenatal planning. We met with the palliative care team, and we discussed what it may be like when the coroner came to collect Pearl's body from the labor and delivery room. I met with the funeral home, and I put those plans into place, and we bought nothing that parents typically purchase when preparing for a newborn. Ruth had days where she dreaded going out, even to the grocery store, as the typical questions and assumptions from well-meaning strangers can prove crushing in these situations. No one ever assumes that the child you're carrying is dealing with a terminal diagnosis. But truly, it wasn't all heartbreak. The way our community rallied was a sight to behold, and I could talk for hours about the way that they carried us. I could tell you how our pastor's wife joined us for so many of those extended ultrasounds, or how friends paid our bills so that I could quit a job that required travel. I could tell you how for months our church cooked our meals for us, or sometimes they just came and cried in our living room while sharing how God was changing them through Pearl. I could even tell you how friends held a benefit concert before she was born to celebrate the life we were already having with Pearl, and how they bought us a minivan after she came home alive and our tiny sedan couldn't hold all of the medical equipment. But my time is too short to do that justice here, so I will leave that surface only scratched. Every time Ruth, Brennan, Abigail, and I sat down for a meal together, we were keenly aware that Pearl too was sitting down for the same meal. Certainly that is always the case when you dine with a pregnant woman, but the awareness of such things became incredibly sharp with Pearl. After being told that she would likely not be born alive, and assuming that the only time we'd have with her was while she was in Ruth's body, her presence became tangible in a way we did not know to experience with Brennan and Abigail. Contrary to the counsel we were given, and not even being sure of what we were doing, Ruth and I grabbed each other by the hand, scooped the older kids into our arms, and we jumped headlong straight into the deep end. We were unaware of just how deep the water was, but felt as if we only waded where we could touch bottom, we would be doing everyone a grave disservice. God was inviting us in to change us, and again, abiding seemed the only appropriate response. What an incredibly sad mistake it would be for us to go through the hard seasons of our lives with our eyes closed and our ears covered, chanting false platitudes to ourselves and waiting for the storms to pass. Surely with that approach, we could avoid a world of pain. But in doing so, we'd miss out on everything else in the process, and especially the main thing, as God has promised to be near to the brokenhearted. It is better to have His presence by way of tremendous heartache than to have frivolity in the midst of spiritual oblivion. We ought to run to where it hurts and to where our hearts break, and perhaps encourage our children to do the same. God has promised to be in those places, and I believe that is often why I am more aware of His presence in the children's ICU than I am the church carnival. Surely He is in both places, but my heart is more acutely tuned to Him during the seasons of suffering and confusion often had with Pearl. And tagging along, saddled on the back of the presence of Christ, is a disproportionate amount of joy, though not always a celebratory and surface one. It is sober, and it is a deeply sustaining joy. And I want to tell you, if you have someone like Pearl in your community, scoot your chair as close to hers as is possible and permissible. For her sake, yes, as you likely have a gift that will help her on her way, but also for your own sake and for the sake of the glory of the one whose image we all bear. And if you know where suffering is happening around you, run to it and not away from it. Engage it and just try. God is near, He is moving, and you have a place. Pearl has now been with us outside the womb for 5.5 years. And honestly, the last few months have been extremely difficult for her. The complications her body has had as of late aren't the same seizure and respiratory complications that she's historically been known for. They are different, and we suspect, as do the doctors, that her body is growing weary. She doesn't seem to be standing in line for a miraculous turnaround. And though her best day will likely be our worst, this seems to be the next chapter for our family. Pearl can't hustle or chase her dreams, and she isn't having her best life now. She can't step into any sort of destiny, can't follow her passions or live adventurously, and hasn't a clue what it means to try harder. She has not been healed as we pleaded for during that first year, but was given these afflictions by the loving hand of her Creator, who knows her intimately and crafted Pearl for her good and His glory. God is with Pearl, and He has not left her to her own devices. The promises that He made to her will in large part not be fulfilled until after her final breath. He carries her as she bears His image, and she, like all of us, is completely helpless otherwise. So if the theology that you're teaching or the banner that you're waving can't honestly be preached to Pearl in her current state, then it is probably not true. At the very least, perhaps you should hold it loosely. It's true that Pearl takes a disproportionate amount of resources from most everyone in her life. The good news, however, the great news, is that no matter the resource, we are all drawing from the King's coffers. It is impossible for us to exhaust that which He has purposed for His work, and we should view such things primarily through a lens of stewardship rather than ownership. This perspective has been key in every decision that we've had to make in regard to Pearl's care, as she does not belong to us. No, Pearl is God's. We are nonetheless charged with trying our best to do right by her. But it has been so freeing to realize that her life does not hang in the balance of the medical decisions we try to make on her behalf. With everything, we are merely stewards and not owners. And I doubt that God is upset or caught off guard when His people steward His resources to care for people like Pearl. Folks tend to remind us rather frequently that she is a blessing and not a burden. And I get what they're saying. But every single one of us is a burden in some ways. Just ask anyone who is helping Ruth and I to be with you here right now. We are all a blessing and a burden, and it's okay to acknowledge that. Because life, by design, is replete with give and take. It's both and not either or. And chicken soup for the soul sentimentalities do not add dignity to Pearl. And overcompensations can sometimes imply that one isn't actually aware of Pearl's innate and divinely portioned dignity, though not always. We are all gifts given by God to one another, and we are all needy. And I'm almost done, but I want to leave you with a quote by Alan Levi from his book, The Last Sweet Mile. Upon hearing of his brother's terminal cancer diagnosis, Alan pressed pause on every endeavor in his life. He wiped his schedule clean and devoted himself entirely to walking through his brother through his last season of life. Alan writes, and yet in the midst of it, I have sensed the quiet, humble, liberating invitation to an unheroic life. Liberating because it just might free me to genuinely love people, individual souls up close rather than big causes from a distance. and emancipate me from a slavish dependence on the praise and attention of others for some sense of validation. The vocabulary for my present season of life is hardly glamorous. Passionate, extreme, crazy, and radical. These words do not fit very well. Tedious, confined, and tired, unnoticed, but also joyful, restful, and real. Those are the words that more honestly describe the landscape of my life these days. And unless I am sadly mistaken, those same words might well apply to the most significant of our human endeavors and to the most valued of human relationships. And I think he's right. Such liberation is one of the greatest gifts that people like Pearl are able to give their communities if their communities are open to receiving it. Thank you so much for sharing your time and for allowing me a seat at your table this afternoon.